Okay, hello everybody. I wanted to make a quick video talking about my recollections, experiences of Hull or Kingston upon Hull back in the 90s and noughties. There are different things that I want to get onto, but I think the most important thing to say is that Hull back then was a very vibrant place in terms of street life and things like that, shopping and things. There was a real abundance of people out on Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. Markets were usually busy. Used to have on a Sunday where I used to live in East Hull, it used to be like a car boot sale. Are they even still a thing anymore? I don't know, but there was just so many things that were iconic, for me at least. When I look back, when I look back now, it's more like sort of opening an album up and sort of just seeing little snapshots rather than things being crystal clear like there would have been a few years ago. I think that's just something that happens as you age, things, and as well, I think as brain development goes, I think you don't tend to usually sort of, unless it's something that's really like traumatic or something like that, I guess, you don't tend to kind of remember all of the details of things. It tends to just be sort of like just moments in time, or just sort of like snapshots of a certain period, a certain day, time, whatever. It's like I couldn't tell you like what I was doing on the 1st of November 2002 or something like whatever, just for example. But I can give you an idea of what it was like of those times. And when I look back through videos and stuff that I see on YouTube of those times, of course, in my head, I'm looking back at things through the spectrum of me being a child and a teenager. But having said that, when you actually look back at footage of your childhood and pictures of the period that you grew up in, those formative years, it is actually in many respects as it is in my head, but in other ways it's different. It's a weird, it's quite a strange thing, really. It is and it isn't what I think it is. I don't really know how else to explain it. But yeah, so growing up in the time that I did so I was born in 1990. Obviously grew up throughout became pretty much. I can't really say I remember that much before 96, really. To be honest, I'm sure somewhere deep down there in my brain there will be there are memories of things when I was 5 and 4, but I can't recall things off the top of my head. But I'm pretty sure there are things. I do have elements of I have suspicions of memories and things, like I can kind of remember things, but I'm not exactly sure if they're real memories. I've talked about that before, I think, on YouTube, but for the most part, really, my main memories come from, I'd say, 96 onwards, 96, 97 onwards. And I think the reason for that is because in 1996 we moved into a new house, a bigger house than we had before. Wasn't that far away from where we lived previously, in East Hull, but so that was kind of like a moment, like as a child, moving into a new house is quite. I guess it's a memorable thing. So, but yeah, growing up as a kid in the 90s, it's weird, like, because it was, now it's considered to be this sort of this legendary. It's got this sort of legendary status to us now, because of how things have changed and where we are now in the modern day. But like any time, I guess, like just like 20, 20, 30 years from now, we'll look back at this time, and this will have some kind of, you know, you know, we'll look back at this time fondly in certain ways, I guess. But at the time, it was just another, you know, for me, that was just normal life. That was my world. That was the world that I grew up in, and I was a part of. It was weird because it was a world, I think, in many ways, that was caught between. It was caught between, you know, sort of, I guess, like visions of the millennium and visions of the you know, what the 21st century, what people thought that was going to be, whatever. But also, it was a kind of Klingon period from the sort of like, I guess, elements of like the 60s, 70s, 80s. When you listen to sort of a lot of music, there's a lot of influences of, and especially as you get towards the latter part of the 90s and into the early 90s, with house music and the influence of like disco and things like that, funk and boogie and so forth. But really, it was a period of, it was a well, look, I can't speak on everybody for everybody in my city, and you know, obviously everyone's had their own experiences, and if you grew up in that time, whether you was a child, a teenager, an adult, whatever. But for me as a child growing up in that time, it was, you know, when I look back at it, when you see footage of things, it's like kind of a bit dingy and a bit kind of industrial and a bit gritty. It's difficult to describe it. But on the other hand, it was like looking to the future, kind of like very, you know, lots of bright colours, and I just like things like I'm going all over the place here with this video. You'll have to excuse me, but it's kind of doing this off the cuff, as I do with all my videos. I don't really I have an idea of what I want to talk about, but I don't have a script. I don't do things like that. This is just how I tend to make my videos. I've got an idea, I've got certain things I know that I'm going to talk about, want to talk about, but that's about it. But yeah, during that period of time, it was very, very interesting to be a child, a teenager. It was buzzing back then. Like there was just so much. It just seemed to be like everything just seemed alive, really. Like it was really quite a magical period of time to have grown up in. Like the toys, you know, the gadgets, the advertisements on TV, just like ridiculous things like liveries of buses and trains, and just the way things were back then. It seemed to be more vibrant. It seemed to be more interesting. People weren't so like obsessed with, you know, this whole thing of everything's racist, everything's sexist, blah 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 blah, woke ideology, and you know, seeping into every nook and cranny of society. But yeah, it was just a really, really special time. Like just like going back on transport, for example, like just everything really. The cars that were around then, the trucks I used to see, you know, the buses, you know, like there was a lot of Leyland vehicles around when I was a kid, a lot of Volvo stuff, like step entrance buses, like they're kind of more or less pretty much a thing of the past now. It was, I guess, really what I'm trying to say is that it was I think it was a world that it was a place in time that was caught between two worlds, really. On the one hand, it was still a kind of it was coming out of the sort of analog era and moving into the digital era. And I don't just mean with regards to music. I think it's a good description of that period of time in many ways, because just for example, just on the buses angle, step entrance. This video might seem quite odd to some people. I'm sorry if it is. But for example, a lot of the buses back then, even up until the late noughties really, there was still a lot of step entrance buses. But certainly as a kid, predominantly in my city, and there was a lot of independents around then as well, which there aren't too many of them now. A lot of step entrance buses, and so many buses with just such good. For me, that's where my head belongs. I think is what I'm trying to get at here. In my mind, that's who I am. I think it's weird because you don't realise how things influence you, but just a lot of things like the lighting of the buses and things. I think that in some ridiculous way probably maybe had an influence on my personality, because the lighting of those buses was dimmer than a lot modern lighting and stuff, and there was more of a sense of comfort, and things were noisier back then. A lot of things were a lot noisier. And the smells of petrol and diesel and things. I remember when I was at school, we used to have a company that I actually ended up working for later on a few occasions, unfortunately. One of the worst decisions probably I ever made, but never mind. I remember the tractor coming to the school, the old Case 4230, and then the Hater LT322, LT324 triple mowers, cylinder mowers used to come to the school. This is a weird video, I know, but it is what I said at the start. It's recollections, it's memories. Seeing them come to the school before it was the Ransoms 213. People who know what I'm talking about, those were epic things to see and hear as a kid. Still now, actually, admittedly. But yeah, there was just so much music to. I might sound like a bit over the top or whatever, but there was a lot of really interesting sounds back then, like just the way that the sound of how buses reversed, and the sounds of Perkins and Cummins engines, and just certain noises from buses and trains when they were waiting to go, whatever, or parked up for a period of time, and just hear this sound, and hissing sounds and things like this, and just I don't know. This is a really, really weird video. To me it was a time that I'm so thankful, so glad to have been brought up in, because I think if I'd have been born in 2000, I started becoming a teenager in 2012. By that time, a lot of stuff was changing by then. I mean, really, for me, in my head, the years, from the point where I was born in April 1990 up until, I'd say, sort of 06, 07 time, but probably more heading on to 08, 09 time. To me, those were, in many ways, the best years of my life. Because I was a kid, I was a teenager, I was rebellious, as just teenagers tend to be. I had a lot more freedom, I guess, in certain ways. You could get away with so much more, you could do so much more because you're a kid. it doesn't really matter, you know. And you just so much more freedom back then as well. Like there just weren't as many regulations and like now, and it was interesting seeing. You know, when I grew up, I grew up in a city that was essentially a product of the I think it's the 13th century really, in terms of its foundings, foundations, and you can see, you know, with Holy Trinity, or the Minster now, Hull Minster, and you know, as you get through to sort of, you know, the 18th and 19th centuries, a lot more buildings are popping up across the city, and then as you get into 20th century, there's a lot of like public sort of swimming baths and things being put up, and you know, office buildings and all sorts of, you know, like the Guild Hall and things like that, and City Hall and so forth. And then as you get towards the middle of the 1900s, you start seeing all these sort of grotesque looking structures being built. You know, the old bus station offices, I think built in the 50s or 60s, and certainly the old bus station itself, the actual structure of the station part, where people used to wait, that was I think that was a product of the 40s, I think, 30s or 40s. So I grew up in a city that was surrounded by history, but it was weird. Like we were looking to the future. I grew up in it's weird. Like it's difficult to explain like exactly what it was like to be around there. It's very, very difficult to give you, to explain how I felt back then. Like I'd say it's virtually impossible. I can't give you the emotions to get you to, because if I could share my emotions and how I properly feel in my own mind about it, like you'd like, oh wow, I get it now. I understand. Like if you saw the things I'd seen and you'd experienced, well, obviously a lot of people had, like my brother, and obviously anybody else was in the city around that time as a kid or whatever. So it was a world that was, you know, the 20th and 21st century. I was caught between those two, and you know, it was a time where computers, for example, like they were obviously they were around, but they weren't like they didn't like dominate over everything like they do now. Like I didn't have a smartphone really until I was like, honestly, probably like 22 or something, 23 probably, I'm guessing. Would that be right? I had my very first phone when I was 18, but that was just an old Nokia. Don't think you could access the internet. I think you could, but it was very, very basic, very basic. So, you know, I grew up in a time where like, yeah, your computers were everywhere, but they weren't. You didn't like. I mean, look, when I went to primary school, like obviously Windows 95 was like there when I was you know, starting to get into my little part of my early childhood years. So so there was, you know, computers have always been in my life from when I was young, very young. But it wasn't really, honestly, until I'd say sort of probably 2002, 2003 time, where I started to use computers more. And the only reason for that actually was because I can't think of it. I think it was called Mr. Walker. We had a teacher at Isaac Newton School. I think his name was Mr. Walker, and he used to let us. I mean, you couldn't get away with that now. I mean, it was shocking, really. But of course, as a kid, as young, you know, I was 12 then, 12, 13 then, so I didn't really mind. And nobody else seemed to complain about it. We were allowed to go on the internet for that whole class. I mean, you wouldn't get away with that now. You wouldn't. You couldn't get away with anything like that now. It was shocking, but at the same time, it was like, because it was based. I think, you know, the only class where I was really ever allowed to like play on the internet for like most of the lesson, whatever. You know, nobody really said anything. So, but yeah, that was the time when I started to become more and more. Not addicted, but like, you know, just I was becoming more used to going on the internet because it became a regular occurrence. But it wasn't really until 2005, 2006 time when I started to kind of become a little bit more addicted to the internet. So I was 15, 16 years old, because I had a laptop for a school project. It was like Isaac. It was like a joint BTEC thing between Isaac Newton School and Archbishop Thurston. And everyone got a laptop to start. You know, we had to make like a quite a big project, and it was a BTEC in ICT or whatever it was. I can't remember exactly the full name of it, but that's when I really started to use the internet a lot more. But really, I started collecting, started using, I guess really was. I guess I started to become a bus enthusiast, a train enthusiast, which I am, by the way. Even now, I'm obviously not the same way as I used to be, because I'm in my 30s now. But I still watch things on YouTube, and I still have a passion for like a lot of the stuff that a lot of the buses and trains that I grew up with. But yeah, anyway. So yeah, I really started to become more aligned with like the internet, kind of becoming a little bit more interested in it really when I was sort of 12, 13, 14 years old. And by the time I was 15, 16, I pretty much was more or less online pretty often. But it wasn't until I was about 19, I think it was. Yeah, 19, when I first had a social media account. Up until that point, I'd only ever had any. I think my first email was in 2006, I think. I'll have to check on Yahoo, but I think it was 2005 or 2006 maybe. So, you know, I as it goes, I pretty much grew up with the internet, kind of. But look, it's a world away compared to how it is today. You know, now everyone's got, obviously I'm using an iPad right now. Everyone's got a pretty much everybody, more or less across the entire globe now, more give or take, has got access to the internet. And for the most part, probably most people have a phone or an iPad or a computer. That wasn't the case when I was young. Most people didn't have a computer because they were expensive. And actually, as I've said multiple times before on the Facebook Lives and on YouTube as well, videos I've done on YouTube, the internet was shit, excuse my language, but it was shit back then. Like, it was dead slow. It was crap. So most people didn't, I mean, in terms of like downloading like images and videos and things like that, it was garbage, absolute garbage. It wasn't really until the early 2000s, mid 2000s, that I think really honestly the internet started to take off properly. I mean, the internet didn't even really become a thing, I think, until, what was it, 91, 92, I think it was. In its like as we would recognise it anyway. So, I did grow up with the internet, but it wasn't like it wasn't like a dependent. It wasn't a dependency thing. It wasn't like I didn't rely on it like as I do now. That really started when I was 15, 16. I started to become like admittedly, when I started, I shouldn't say this, but let's be honest, when I started to watch pornography, basically, as lads do, or as you do when you become a teenager, you start getting interested in that kind of stuff. So that was that 2005, 2006. That's when I just kind of started to become more addicted to the internet. And that's when I started collecting a lot more like pictures of like buses and trains and things like that, tractors and that. Just when I look back, it's a bit kind of cringy really, but it was just there were just things I was just fascinated with. I was just really, I don't know exactly what caused it. I'm guessing it's probably influences of my father, because my father was, from what I can gather anyway, quite a bit of an enthusiast himself, certainly when it comes to steam engines and old like Mark One, I guess DMUs and old like proper diesel units, like Deltics and things like that, Class 47, so forth. The HST, Class 43 and so forth, blah blah blah. But so I think my father had a massive influence on me, in terms of like my interest in like machinery, like farm machinery and tractors and things like that, and also my enthusiasm for buses and trains, which I guess I passed on to some extent to my brother, and he became like really, but I'm guessing so anyway. But obviously my father had influences on my brother's interests as well. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, growing up when I did, there was a lot more character and a lot more diversity of things back then, and it was a time where there was a lot of influences from America, Japan, Europe. The music back then, it was all sorts of different styles of electronic music. There's just so many great cartoons on as well for kids back then. I think, what was it called? Like Come Outside, like Bernard's Watch, like Rosie and Jim, all those kind of things. Like there were loads. And I can see them in my head. I just can't think of what the names of them are. Zap, I think one was called Zap. Wolves, Witches and Giants. There's another one. There were a lot of fantastic cartoons and series and dramas and movies back then. It was a real. I think in many respects like a time of cultural shift. There was a lot going on back then. I just remember the hustle and bustle of going into like Princess Key and the main shopping centre as it was then, and it just been a lot of the time, not all, but all the time, but a lot of the time being absolutely packed, especially at the weekends, and just seeing all these old like. The older generation as it was then as well, like the people that people that had been brought up in the 20s and 1920s, 1930s. That generation of people, we saw there was people were different back then. And I really, of course, people are people, but I think every decade, every generation has a massive influence on how people like, obviously how people speak and think and their habits and so forth. And there were just things about the way people were back then. It's becoming rare now, not only because people are dying, getting old, but I just think that things have really started to changes have really ramped up these last sort of 10 years, and the world that I knew, the world that I thought was going to be around. I guess I thought it was that was the way that the world would be forever. Has gone really, for pretty much. It's a really difficult thing to explain. And this is not what this video is about, but I just want to mention it. This sort of like sense of loss, this sense of bereavement that you feel as you get older, and as the decades move on, and you get older, and you change, and other people change, and like society and culture changes, as it always tends to do. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't want to have been trapped in that world forever. It's always interesting to move on in life and to see how things progress, and you make the best of any given time and period that you're in, that you're fortunate to be alive in, as long as there's not too many problems going on and so forth. But it's difficult to come to terms with that realization that world that you have in your head, and that version of yourself that you have in your head back then. Those things in your mind, they haven't gone, they're still there. But of course, in the real world, they went a long time ago. Really up until I'd say sort of up until more or less the end of the noughties, I'd say sort of 08, 09-ish sort of period. It was the country really had kind of in some ways been the same to some extent since sort of the mid to late 90s, kind of, give or take. And it was really, I'd say really, I think from sort of like 2011, 2012 onwards, that's when the country shifted away from what I would call the noughties period, in the sense of how things were. Like things started to change around. I know that sounds like a bleeding the obvious thing to say, but what I mean is, I think after sort of like 2010, 2011, it's difficult to pinpoint, obviously, but sort of 2011, 2012 time, I'd say that's when we saw the country shifting to a new period, a new block of its history. Up until then, I think it was, you kind of saw a lot of the same vehicles, I think really it was in the late to mid to 2010s when, for me personally, the country that I knew, that I, in many ways, not every way, but a lot of ways, I liked and felt a part of, and I felt comfortable in, I guess, was gone. And you could say that's just a byproduct of getting, growing up and becoming an adult, and that, I'm sure that is definitely a significant factor in it. But I just think that things really started to change once we had the financial crisis of 08, when the high street was more or less killed off, give or take, in the next few years. And a lot of these giant companies started disappearing, and and it's just starting to see a lot of things change. Really, 2007 onwards, that's when for me whole changed in many respects, and I don't think for me, and it is a selfish thing, but for me, I don't. Of course, I've had a lot of great memories since then, especially with things like the bus scene and being a bus enthusiast, that was still good up until sort of 2010, 2011 time, 2012 time, really. But of course, everyone reaches a point in their lives where you can't go carrying on as you did when he was a teenager, when he was a very young adult, because it would be ridiculous. I mean, you could say, put your fingers up to society and all that kind of society's expectations and blah blah blah, and whatever. But I don't know. I think just naturally anyway, you just kind of begin to change a little bit by incremental changes as you get older, and before you know it, you're a different person. When I look back to the person that I was 10 years ago, in many ways I'm pretty much a different person, really. On the outside, in some respects, and on the inside, some respects. But with all that, there are, of course, everyone's carrying around a big bag of memories and emotions, and like I said at the beginning, snapshots of your life, your early life, and and they're always there. And the things I think about, not all the time, not every day, but most days, by that I mean maybe a couple of times per week or whatever, maybe once every, I don't know, just quite often, but not all the time every day, because I've got other things to do, I've got a life to get on with, and you can't just be sitting there reflecting and reminiscing about your life all day long every day, because you'd end up in bloody manic depression. So and I say that because I tend to look back, maybe to some extent with rose-tinted glasses. But I also look back because I had a lot of joy, as much as there was a lot of problems with bullying when I was a kid, and maybe in some ways the world perhaps is a little bit better than it used to be, because I don't know. I think we've gone from one extreme to the other. I think we needed some kind of middle ground with regards to, equality and, dealing with injustices and all sorts of, society-related problems. So, there were a lot of problems in the 90s, and, and like I said before, it was a great place in many respects. There were a lot of problems in the 90s, there was a lot of antisocial behaviour. There was a lot of joyriding going on back then. There was a lot of arson attacks out in my city. There was a lot of stealing going on. Like anybody's life, it's a mixed bag of emotions. It's a mixed bag of memories. It's a mixed bag of thoughts, and as you get older, you tend to kind of reflect on things a little bit differently than the last few years, certainly a decade or so before. So as you get older, you tend to start looking at things with a new perspective, new thoughts, new insights into things that you didn't have maybe just a few years ago. So, there's that to say as well. But I do miss a lot of things about my childhood and my teens. The freedom of just getting on a train and buggering off for a few hours and just going wherever the hell I wanted, and of course I could do that now. But as a teenager, because I didn't have a massive group of friends. I had a handful of friends back then. Good friends, close friends, but I was never let's be honest, I was never a massively popular kid at school, at primary school or secondary. But I wasn't like a nerd, or I wasn't the most bullied kid at school or anything like that. I was caught in the middle, I guess. I stood up for myself, but I sometimes brought on my own problems, so I don't miss that aspect of growing up. But look, we all learn as we get up, as we're growing up, and no one gives you the book to. There's no perfect way, I don't think, of dealing with things, but I certainly do miss you know, my family as it was back then in certain ways, like when I see my grandfather, my grandmother, you know, my uncle when he was still alive, God bless his soul. Obviously my grandmother and grandfather, like I said, and they were alive. And my pets that I had back then, you know, the excitement, just the excitement of being a kid. You know, the things that I heard on the radio back then, and you know, watching the TV in the morning before I went to school, the cartoons I used to watch with my friend David before we used to go to primary school, the whole Transformers popularity thing that exploded back then, the Pokemon thing that came along in the late part of the 90s. I got into that. So it was as a child and as a teenager, in my opinion, in many respects, not all, but in many ways, though those 2 decades were incredibly vibrant, colourful, in certain ways, but also there were times that had a lot of problems. So, you know, it's when I look back at, I'm going to finish now, but so I guess what I'm trying to say is that I look back with both, you know, a sort of bittersweet kind of taste, you know, a bittersweet feeling about it all. On the one hand, you know, there were so many great memories of travelling with my father on buses and travelling with my grandfather. Certain snacks and things used to get back then. The friends that I had back then as well. There's a lot of things that I'm thankful for, and I'm glad that I got to be a part of those things. And if I die tomorrow, you know, hopefully I don't, but if I do, I had a good life. I had a good, more or less, you know, a good childhood, teenagehood for the most part, and you know, just incredibly grateful, and I'll always be grateful for the memories that I got to make. I didn't realise there were going to be memories at that time, but it was a good time. But overall, it was a good time to be a kid.